The morning sun peeked through the curtains of Harold Thompson's modest suburban home, casting warm shadows across his weathered face. At 93 years old, the World War II veteran had settled into a comfortable routine that brought him peace in his golden years. His wrinkled hands, which had once gripped rifle handles and steered military vehicles, now found joy in simpler tasks. Every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., Harold would wake up and look at the silver-framed photograph of Eleanor, his wife of 62 years, who had passed away 3 years ago. "Another day, my dear," he would whisper to her image, a habit he couldn't break. Eleanor's gentle smile and the photograph seemed to give him strength for each new day. Harold's house, though small, was a testament to his organized nature. Military medals hung proudly on the living room wall, each one polished weekly. The walls were decorated with black and white photographs from his service days, showing a handsome young soldier standing beside various military vehicles. But his most prized possession was the picture of him and Eleanor on their wedding day in 1948, just after he returned from the war. The old veteran's day always started with a careful grooming routine. Despite living alone, he maintained high standards of personal appearance. He would put on a clean, pressed shirt and his favorite navy blue sweater, even in warm weather. His shoes, though old, sparkled with regular polishing, a habit he couldn't shake from his military days. By 7:15 a.m., Harold would step out onto his front porch, checking his beloved garden first thing. The garden was his pride and joy, filled with Eleanor's favorite flowers, red roses, purple petunias, and white lilies. He had learned gardening from her, and now it was his way of keeping her memory alive. The neighbors often stopped to admire his perfectly maintained flower beds and neatly trimmed lawn. The highlight of Harold's morning was his walk to Joe's Diner, 3 blocks away from his house. He would grab his worn leather wallet, his house keys, and his veteran's cap, which he wore with quiet pride. The walk took him exactly 12 minutes, and he enjoyed every step, nodding hello to the school children waiting for their bus and waving to the morning joggers who had become familiar faces over the years. At Joe's Diner, everyone knew Harold. The bell above the door would ring as he entered at precisely 7:30 a.m., and Sally, the friendly waitress with graying hair, would already have his regular order ready: 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, and a cup of black coffee. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," she would call out cheerfully, leading him to his usual booth by the window. The other regular customers at Joe's treated Harold with respect, often stopping by his table to chat or thank him for his service. Young children would sometimes stare at his veteran's cap with curiosity, and Harold would smile, occasionally sharing simple stories about his time in the service, carefully leaving out the harsh realities of war. After breakfast, Harold would spend his mornings tending to his garden or doing small repairs around his house. He took pride in maintaining everything himself, though his son James, who lived 2 hours away, often insisted on helping. "I may be old," Harold would tell them on their weekly phone calls, "but I'm not helpless." The peaceful neighborhood where Harold lived had been his home for over 4 decades. The streets were quiet, lined with maple trees that had grown tall and strong over the years. Children played safely in their yards, and neighbors looked out for each other. It was exactly the kind of life Harold had fought for during the war. As spring turned to summer that year, Harold had no way of knowing that his peaceful routine was about to be disrupted. The abandoned lot next to his property, which had stood empty for years, was about to become the center of a change that would turn his quiet life upside down. But for now, he sat in his favorite armchair, reading the morning newspaper, enjoying the tranquility he had earned after a lifetime of service. The only sound was the gentle ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from Eleanor's parents, marking time in the peaceful house. Through his window, Harold could see his garden blooming in the morning light, a sight that always brought a smile to his weathered face. Life was simple, but it was good. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in June. Harold was trimming his roses when he heard the distant rumble of motorcycle engines. At first, he didn't think much of it. Motorcycles sometimes passed through the neighborhood, but this time the sound grew louder and didn't fade away. 5 motorcycles pulled into the abandoned lot next to Harold's property. Their chrome parts sparkled in the sunlight, and their black paint looked menacing. The riders were dressed in leather jackets despite the warm weather, with patches and symbols Harold didn't recognize. They removed their helmets, revealing faces marked with rough beards and stern expressions. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick black beard streaked with gray, caught Harold staring. He was Mike Steele Davidson, though Harold wouldn't learn his name until later. Steele's cold blue eyes locked onto Harold's, and his mouth curved into an unfriendly smile. He nudged one of his companions and pointed at the old veteran, causing several of them to laugh. That evening, the bikers stayed in the lot until well past midnight. They played loud music from portable speakers, their voices growing louder as they drank beer after beer. The noise made it impossible for Harold to enjoy his evening routine of watching the news or reading his favorite war history books. Even with all his windows closed, the sound of revving engines and rough laughter filled his home. The next morning, Harold discovered empty beer cans and cigarette butts scattered across his garden. Some of his precious flowers had been trampled, including a patch of Eleanor's favorite petunias. With shaking hands, he picked up the trash, his heart heavy as he looked at the damaged flowers. This garden was his last connection to Eleanor, and seeing it disrespected hurt him deeply. Over the next few days, more motorcycles began appearing in the lot. What started as 5 bikes soon grew to 15, then 20. The bikers set up makeshift shelters using tarps and began treating the lot like their personal clubhouse. They installed bright floodlights that blazed into Harold's bedroom window at night, making it difficult for him to sleep. His peaceful walks to Joe's diner became uncomfortable experiences. The bikers would rev their engines as he passed, the noise so loud it made him jump. Some would circle around him on their motorcycles, coming uncomfortably close. Sally at the diner noticed the change in him. His hands trembled more when he held his coffee cup, and he stopped sitting by the window. One morning, Harold found graffiti on his fence, crude drawings and words that made his face burn with anger. He spent 3 hours scrubbing it off, his old muscles aching from the effort. The bikers watched from their lot, laughing and making jokes about the old-timers' cleanup service. The other neighbors began avoiding the area around Harold's house. Parents stopped letting their children play on that side of the street. The sound of children's laughter, which Harold had always enjoyed, was replaced by the constant rumble of motorcycle engines and loud music. Even James, Harold's son, noticed the change during their weekly phone calls. "Dad, you sound tired," he said one evening. "Maybe you should come stay with us for a while." But Harold refused. This was his home, filled with memories of Eleanor and their life together. He wouldn't be driven away. The final straw came when Harold found motorcycle tracks across his front lawn. Deep tire marks cut through the grass he had carefully maintained for decades. Standing there, looking at the damaged lawn, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced since his war days. A combination of anger and determination. That night, as the biker's laughter echoed through his bedroom, Harold lay awake, staring at his ceiling. The old soldier in him wanted to fight back, but he knew he couldn't take on 20 young men in a physical confrontation. He needed a different approach, something they wouldn't expect from a 93-year-old man. As another motorcycle engine roared outside his window, a wild idea began forming in Harold's mind. It was crazy, possibly dangerous, and definitely not what anyone would expect from someone his age. But as he thought about it more, a small smile appeared on his face. Maybe it was time to show these young troublemakers that they had underestimated this old veteran. The next morning, Harold woke up earlier than usual. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, straightening his collar and putting on his veteran's cap with extra care. If he was going to talk to the bikers, he wanted to look respectable. His military training had taught him that appearance could command respect, and he needed all the respect he could get today. By 8 o'clock, the bikers had already started gathering in their lot. Harold watched from his kitchen window as they arrived one by one, their motorcycles growling like angry animals. He counted 12 of them this morning, including Steele, their leader, who was easy to spot with his tall frame and distinctive black leather jacket with silver studs. Harold took a deep breath and walked out his front door. His neighbors watched from behind their curtains as he made his way toward the lot. Some of them wanted to stop him, worried for his safety, but none dared to interfere. The old veteran walked with purpose, his back straight despite his age, just as he had been taught in the military. As he approached the group, the bikers nudged each other and pointed, smirking at the sight of the elderly man walking toward them. Steele stood up from his motorcycle seat, towering over Harold's smaller frame. Well, Steele said loudly, making sure his friends could hear, "Looks like Grandpa's come to join the party." Harold looked up at Steele, meeting his eyes without fear. "Young man," he said in a clear, steady voice, "I'd like to have a word with you about being neighbors." The other bikers gathered around, forming a circle that made Harold feel like he was back in the war, surrounded by enemy forces. But he didn't let his nervousness show. "I've lived here for 40 years, Harold continued, his voice carrying the weight of his experiences. "My wife and I built a life here. All I'm asking is for some basic respect. Keep the noise down after dark, clean up your trash, and leave my property alone." He gestured toward his damaged garden and lawn as he spoke. Steele listened with an exaggerated look of concentration on his face, then burst out laughing. The other bikers joined in, their laughter echoing off the surrounding houses. "Listen, old-timer," Steele said, stepping closer to Harold. "Times change. This ain't your quiet little neighborhood anymore. It's our territory now." Harold tried a different approach, drawing from his military experience. "I was a sergeant in World War II, he explained, hoping to find common ground. "I understand brotherhood and loyalty. That's all I'm asking for, mutual respect between neighbors." One of the younger bikers spoke up, his voice mocking. "Hey Steele, maybe we should give him a salute." The group erupted in laughter again, and someone started a motorcycle engine, drowning out Harold's next words. Steele made an exaggerated saluting gesture, causing more laughter from his gang. As Harold stood there, surrounded by jeering faces, he remembered similar moments from the war, times when he had to stand his ground despite overwhelming odds. But this was different. These weren't enemy soldiers. These were young men who had no respect for their elders or their community. "You got two choices, Gramps," Steele said, leaning down to get in Harold's face. "Either you learn to live with us, or you move somewhere else. Maybe a nice retirement home." The suggestion brought another round of cruel laughter from the group. Harold looked around at the circle of mocking faces, then back at Steele. "Every man deserves a chance to make things right," he said quietly. "I'm giving you that chance." With those words, he turned and walked away, keeping his pace steady despite wanting to hurry. Behind him, he could hear the bikers making jokes and imitating his walk. Back in his house, Harold sat in his favorite chair, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline wore off. Through his window, he could see the bikers had already forgotten about him, returning to their loud music and rowdy behavior. His attempt at peaceful resolution had failed completely. Looking at Eleanor's picture on the wall, Harold felt a determination growing inside him. "Well, my dear," he whispered to her image, "looks like we'll have to try something else." His mind returned to the wild idea he'd had the night before. If diplomacy wouldn't work, maybe it was time for a more unexpected approach. A week after Harold's failed attempt to talk with the bikers, things got much worse. He woke up early one morning to find his front yard completely silent. Too silent. Usually, he could hear the gentle wind chimes Eleanor had hung years ago, but today there was nothing. Walking to his front porch, Harold's heart stopped. The wind chimes were gone. But that wasn't the worst part. His eyes moved to the small garden memorial he had created for Eleanor. The beautiful stone angel that watched over her favorite flowers lay broken on the ground. Around it, the flowers had been deliberately crushed, tire tracks cutting through the carefully tended soil. Harold's hands trembled as he picked up pieces of the broken angel. For 3 years, this memorial had been his way of keeping Eleanor close. Every morning and evening, he would talk to her here, telling her about his day. Now it was destroyed. Still holding the broken pieces, Harold looked up at his front window and noticed something else was wrong. The display case containing his war medals was empty. The glass had been broken, and all his medals, including his Purple Heart and Silver Star, were gone. These medals had been more than just medal and ribbon to him. They were proof of his service, his sacrifice, and his survival. In his kitchen, Harold sat heavily in a chair, feeling every one of his 93 years. Through his window, he could see the bikers already gathering in their lot. Some of them were looking his way and laughing. One was wearing what looked like his medals pinned to his leather jacket, making exaggerated marching movements while others clapped. Sally from the diner called him around breakfast time, worried because he hadn't shown up for his usual morning coffee. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, "maybe you should call the police." But Harold knew that wouldn't solve anything. The police had already been called several times by neighbors, but they never found enough evidence to do anything about the bikers. As the day went on, Harold sat in his living room, looking at old photographs. One showed him in his military uniform, standing proud next to his motorcycle, a Harley-Davidson Dolly, the same model he had ridden during the war. In another, he was with his unit, the famous Ghost Riders, known for their stealth missions behind enemy lines. The sound of motorcycles outside grew louder as more bikers arrived. Their music blasted through his walls, and their laughter felt like it was mocking his pain. But something was changing inside Harold. The sadness and helplessness were being replaced by something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. That evening, James called for their regular chat. "Dad," he said, hearing the strain in Harold's voice, "I'm coming to get you tomorrow. You can't stay there anymore. It's not safe." Harold listened to his son's worried voice but didn't agree to leave. Instead, he asked James a surprising question. "Son, remember that military pension money I've been saving?" After hanging up, Harold walked to Eleanor's broken memorial one last time. The setting sun cast long shadows across his ruined garden. He could hear the bikers in their lot, their music and laughter floating through the evening air. One of them revved their engine repeatedly, probably trying to annoy him further. Standing there, Harold made a decision that would have seemed crazy just a few days ago. He wasn't going to run away. He wasn't going to hide inside his house. And he definitely wasn't going to let these bullies win. He was a ghost rider, after all, and ghost riders didn't back down from a fight. Walking back inside, Harold picked up his phone and made a call he never thought he'd make at his age. His hands were steady now, his voice firm as he spoke. The person on the other end seemed surprised by his request, but agreed to help. As Harold went to bed that night, the biker's noise still filling his home, he felt different. For the first time since they arrived, he smiled. Tomorrow, he would show these young troublemakers that they had picked the wrong veteran to bully. His plan was crazy, dangerous, and completely unexpected, exactly what he needed it to be. The next morning, instead of walking to Joe's diner, Harold rode there in a taxi. His destination wasn't the diner, though. It was Mike's Motorcycles, the shop next door. The owner, Mike Wilson, a gray-haired man in his 60s, was waiting for him. They had talked on the phone the night before, and Mike had agreed to open the shop early just for Harold. "You sure about this?" Mike asked as Harold walked slowly among the shining motorcycles. Harold nodded, his eyes fixed on one particular bike, a restored 1942 Harley-Davidson Bullied, similar to the one he had ridden in the war. It wasn't as powerful as modern bikes, but it was perfect for what he needed. Using a large portion of his saved pension money, Harold bought the motorcycle. Mike looked worried as he helped Harold with the paperwork. "Mr. Thompson," he said carefully, "riding at your age, it's risky." Harold smiled, remembering times he had faced much bigger risks during the war. That afternoon, the bikers in the lot watched in disbelief as a truck delivered Harold's motorcycle to his driveway. Steele and his gang gathered at the fence, pointing and laughing as Harold, dressed in a new leather jacket, slowly approached his bike. "Hey boys," Steele called out, "looks like Grandpa's having a late-life crisis." The other bikers roared with laughter, but Harold ignored them. He was focused on remembering everything Mike had taught him that morning about modern motorcycles. They were different from the ones he had ridden in the war, but the basics were the same. Harold's first attempt to start the bike failed. The bikers laughed harder. His second attempt failed too, bringing more mockery. But on the third try, the engine roared to life. The sound brought back memories of his war days, and suddenly, Harold felt 50 years younger. Over the next few days, Harold practiced in his driveway. He fell several times, each tumble bringing hoots of laughter from the bikers. But each time he fell, he got back up. His body ached, and his joints protested, but his determination never wavered. One young biker, Tommy, watched Harold with growing curiosity. Unlike the others, he didn't laugh when Harold struggled. Instead, one morning, while the others were away, he approached Harold. "Your kickstand's not down properly," he said quietly, showing Harold the correct way to position it. Harold thanked him, and they talked briefly about motorcycles. Tommy was surprised to learn that Harold had been a motorcycle messenger in the war. "Really?" he asked, his eyes wide. "You rode through enemy territory." Before Harold could answer, the sound of approaching motorcycles made Tommy hurry away. As days passed, Harold's skills improved. He started taking short rides around the block, his confidence growing with each successful trip. The bikers still mocked him, but now there was a hint of surprise in their voices. They hadn't expected the old man to actually learn to ride. One evening, Harold polished his bike until it gleamed in the sunset. He had replaced the standard seat with a more comfortable one and added some special handles that were easier for his arthritic hands to grip. His new leather jacket, though stiff, was starting to feel natural on his shoulders. Looking at his reflection in the bike's chrome, Harold barely recognized himself. His white hair peeked out from under a black bandana, and his new leather jacket made him look different, stronger somehow. Eleanor would have laughed to see him like this, but he thought she would have understood. That night, as the bikers had their usual loud gathering, Harold made his final preparations. Tomorrow, he would put his plan into action. He wasn't just learning to ride for fun, he had a specific purpose in mind, one that would surprise everyone, especially Steele and his gang. Before going to bed, Harold looked at Eleanor's picture. "Well, my dear," he whispered, "tomorrow's the big day." In the lot next door, the bikers' music thumped through the walls, but for the first time since they arrived, the noise didn't bother him. Soon, they would learn that this old veteran had more surprises in store for them. The day Harold chose to put his plan into action was a Saturday, when he knew all the bikers would be gathered in their lot. He waited until late afternoon, when their party was in full swing. The sound of music and laughter filled the air as he wheeled his motorcycle out of his garage. This time, Harold didn't wear his usual sweater and slacks. Instead, he put on his complete riding gear: black leather jacket, boots, and his old military bandana. Most importantly, he wore something he had kept hidden for decades: his original Ghost Rider's patch, slightly faded, but still clearly showing the unit's famous skull emblem with motorcycle wings. As Harold rode his Harley into the biker's lot, the group fell silent. Even the music seemed to quiet down. Steele stepped forward, a beer in his hand, ready to mock the old man. But before he could speak, Harold did something that caught everyone off guard. He rode his motorcycle in a perfect figure-8 pattern, then brought it to a smooth stop right in front of Steele. "Nice patch, old-timer," Steele said, noticing the Ghost Rider's emblem. "Where'd you buy that costume?" Some of the bikers chuckled, but Tommy, the young biker who had helped Harold earlier, stepped closer, his eyes wide with recognition. "That's not a costume," Tommy said, his voice filled with awe. "That's a real Ghost Rider's patch. My grandfather told me about them. They were a secret motorcycle unit in World War II. The other bikers gathered around, their curiosity overtaking their usual mockery. Harold kicked down his bike's stand and slowly dismounted. His movements were practiced now, confident. "Your grandfather was right, son," he said to Tommy. "We were the 23rd Special Motorcycle Unit, but the Germans called us Ghost Riders because they never saw us coming." Steele crossed his arms, looking skeptical. "Prove it," he challenged. Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. It showed a group of young soldiers on motorcycles, their faces dirty but grinning, standing in front of a bombed-out building in France. "That's me," Harold said, pointing to a young man in the center of the photo. "June 1944, just after D-Day. We ran messages and supplies through enemy territory. No lights, no sound, just the skill to ride fast and quiet through the darkest nights." The bikers passed the photograph around, their expressions changing as they studied it. One of them, an older member named Jack, spoke up. "My dad was in the war. He used to talk about motorcycle messengers who saved his unit by warning them about a German advance. Said they appeared like ghosts in the night." Harold nodded. "That might have been us. We saved a lot of units that way." He went on to tell them about riding through enemy territory, dodging German patrols, carrying crucial messages that helped win the war. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, and the bikers found themselves drawn into his stories. "We had a code," Harold continued, looking directly at Steele. "Never leave a rider behind, always respect the brotherhood, and use our skills to protect, not to harm." The words hung in the air, their meaning clear to everyone present. Tommy broke the silence that followed. "What happened to your medals, sir? The ones we—" He glanced nervously at Steele, who was now looking at the ground, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked like shame. Before Harold could answer, Steele walked to his motorcycle and returned with a small box. Inside were Harold's medals, slightly scratched but intact. "Found these in the trash," Steele muttered, though everyone knew it was a lie. "Thought you might want them back." As Harold carefully took his medals, he noticed the change in the bikers' faces. The mockery was gone, replaced by a mix of respect and embarrassment. Even Steele seemed different, standing straighter, more serious. You know, Steele said slowly, we could use someone with your experience in our club. Teach us some of those Ghost Rider techniques. The other bikers nodded in agreement, and Harold saw what he had been hoping for, a chance to turn enemies into allies. Looking at the group of bikers who had made his life miserable for weeks, Harold smiled. His plan had worked better than he'd expected. Sometimes, he realized, the best way to fight your enemies was to make them your friends. The change in the bikers' behavior didn't happen overnight, but when it came, it was remarkable. The morning after Harold shared his story, he woke up to an unusual sound, or rather, a lack of sound. The usual roar of motorcycles was missing. Instead, he heard voices and what sounded like gardening tools. Looking out his window, Harold couldn't believe his eyes. Steele and several other bikers were in his front yard, working on his garden. They were carefully removing the damaged plants and replacing them with new ones. Tommy was gently putting the pieces of Eleanor's broken angel statue into a box. We got a friend who repairs stone sculptures, Steele explained when he saw Harold coming outside. He said he can fix it good as new. The big biker's voice was different now. No mockery, just simple respect. Harold noticed Steele was wearing his leather jacket, but the crude patches had been replaced with a single new one that read Riders Respect. Throughout the day, more bikers arrived, but not to party. They came with tools, plants, and building materials. Jack, the older biker, turned out to be good with carpentry. He started working on a new display case for Harold's medals, one that would be stronger and more secure than the old one. My grandfather would have kicked my behind if he knew I disrespected a Ghost Rider, Tommy said as he helped Harold plant new roses. The young biker had become particularly attached to Harold, eager to learn about motorcycles and war history. His genuine interest touched Harold's heart. By afternoon, the transformation was incredible. The garden was replanted, with special care taken to make Eleanor's memorial garden more beautiful than before. The bikers had even installed small solar lights around it, so it would glow softly at night. Steele gathered everyone together and cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson," he said, looking uncomfortable but determined, "we've been real jerks. Worse than that, we've been dishonorable." The other bikers nodded in agreement. "We want to make it right, if you'll let us." Harold looked at these men, so different from the troublemakers who had arrived weeks ago. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the bravest thing a man can do is admit when he's wrong." Steele's eyes showed understanding. He recognized the words from one of Harold's war stories. That evening, instead of their usual rowdy party, the bikers organized a different kind of gathering. They cleaned up the lot, set up proper tables and chairs, and even brought a grill for a proper barbecue. Harold was given the place of honor, and one by one, the bikers came to him to apologize and share their own stories. Jack brought his father's old military photos, and Harold recognized some of the locations. Tommy showed everyone a picture of his grandfather, who had served in Korea. Even Steele opened up, talking about his own father who had been a Vietnam veteran, but had passed away before they could reconcile their differences. "Maybe that's why I acted so tough," Steele admitted quietly to Harold. "I was angry at myself for never making things right with my old man." Harold put a hand on Steele's shoulder, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes healing came in unexpected ways. The biggest surprise came when Steele announced that the bike club was changing its rules. "From now on," he declared, "we're going to be about respect, community, and brotherhood. The real kind, like the Ghost Riders showed us." The other bikers cheered in agreement. They asked Harold to be their honorary president, a position he accepted with pride. The lot that had once been a source of trouble was transformed into a proper meeting place. The bikers set up a small memorial corner dedicated to veterans, with Harold's restored medals displayed prominently. As the sun set on that remarkable day, Harold sat in his garden, looking at Eleanor's repaired angel statue. The soft lights around it made it look like it was glowing with approval. From the lot next door came the sound of laughter, not mocking this time, but warm and friendly. "You're right, Eleanor," Harold whispered to the angel. "Sometimes people just need a chance to show their better selves." In the growing darkness, the solar lights in his garden twinkled like stars, and for the first time in weeks, Harold felt truly at peace. 6 months after Harold's unexpected decision to join the bikers, the neighborhood had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The once feared motorcycle club, now known as the Ghost Riders Legacy, had become an important part of the community. Harold's influence had transformed them from troublemakers into protectors. Every Sunday morning, the sound of motorcycles would fill the street. But now it was a welcome sound. The bikers, led by Steele and Harold, would ride to the local veterans' hospital, where they spent time with elderly veterans who rarely got visitors. Harold's stories had inspired them to start this weekly tradition, and it quickly became their most important activity. The abandoned lot next to Harold's house was unrecognizable. The bikers had cleaned it up completely, adding a proper parking area for their motorcycles and a small clubhouse. The walls of the clubhouse were decorated with military photos, including a large, framed picture of Harold and his Ghost Riders unit. Below it hung a sign that read, "Every rider has a story. Every story deserves respect." Tommy, who had become like a grandson to Harold, spent most afternoons learning from the old veteran. Harold taught him about motorcycle maintenance using his restored Harley as a teaching tool. In the war, Harold would say, keeping your bike in perfect condition could mean the difference between life and death. Tommy soaked up every word, proudly wearing the club's new patch that featured a Ghost Rider silhouette. The neighborhood children, who once feared the bikers, now gathered to watch them work on their motorcycles. Steele had started a program teaching bicycle safety to kids, using lessons learned from Harold about responsibility and respect. Parents who had once called the police about the bikers now brought cookies to their meetings. Harold's garden became a special place for the whole community. The bikers took turns helping him maintain it, and Eleanor's memorial garden was more beautiful than ever. They added a small plaque that told the story of the Ghost Riders, making it a place where people would stop to learn about history and pay their respects. James, Harold's son, couldn't believe the change when he visited. Instead of finding his father living in fear, he found him surrounded by a new family. The bikers treated Harold like a beloved father figure, seeking his advice not just about motorcycles, but about life in general. "Dad," James said, watching his father teach Steele about proper engine maintenance, "you've done something amazing here." 1 year after the transformation began, the club organized a special event. Riders from other clubs across the state came to meet the legendary Ghost Rider who had changed a group of troublemakers into respected community members. Harold, wearing his Ghost Rider's patch proudly, shared stories of his war days with a new generation of riders. The local newspaper wrote an article about Harold and the club, titled "The 93-Year-Old Veteran Who Turned Enemies into Brothers." The story spread online, inspiring other motorcycle clubs to start their own veteran support programs. Harold's brave decision had created ripples that reached far beyond his small neighborhood. On quiet evenings, Harold would still sit in his garden, talking to Eleanor's angel statue. But now he often had company. Bikers would join him, listening respectfully as he shared memories of his wife and his war days. The garden became a place of healing, where tough men felt safe showing their softer sides. "You know what, boss?" Steele said one evening, using his nickname for Harold. "When we first saw you, we thought you were just some old man we could push around. Turns out you were the strongest one of all." Harold smiled, remembering how close he had come to giving up and moving away. Sometimes the best victories came from the most unexpected decisions. As Harold looked around at his transformed neighborhood, the respectful bikers, the beautiful garden, the happy children playing nearby, he knew he had created something special. His decision to face his troubles head-on, to turn enemies into friends, had done more than solve his problem. It had created a legacy that would live on long after him. The Ghost Riders never backed down from a challenge. Harold would tell anyone who asked about his story. And sometimes, the greatest victories come not from fighting your enemies, but from showing them a better way. His words became the motto of the club, painted proudly on their clubhouse wall, reminding everyone that it's never too late to make a difference in the world.